Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on sex, sexuality, and supersexuality, in which we're going to be looking at everything from the fall of man and the serpent's gift in the Garden of Eden to the ideas of sexuality and sexual transgression in the life of Christ. And we'll be looking at varied parallels throughout different religious traditions, and we'll end by discussing sort of supersexualities, or sex and sexuality as an avenue to experience the divine or the transcendent. So first off, the serpent's gift. So we've got a story here, and this is from Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and I'm just going to run through the story very briefly to you as it's depicted in the Christian Bible, well, actually in the Hebrew Bible. So this narrative is actually foundational to Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And we hear about it the most, I suppose, in the Christian tradition. And the story of the Garden of Eden is sort of pervades a lot of our Western cultures. So in this story, we see that God has created Adam and he has created Eve, these sort of primordial couples, the first humans. And he tells them that that in the garden that they live in, this Garden of Eden, they may eat of all the fruits and all the plants except for the one at the center of the garden, except for this tree at the center of the garden. He says if they'll eat off that tree, they will die. So the serpent comes on by and he says, you won't die if you eat from the tree, but you will gain knowledge and become like God. So the woman goes forth and eats the apple off the tree. Well, it's not an apple, and eats off the tree. And then she gets the man, her husband, to eat off the tree. Eventually, their eyes are open, and they can see that they are now naked. They know that they are naked. So they sew together loincloths out of leaves. And when God realizes what has occurred, he expels them from the garden. So what's all this about? I mean, first off, let's notice what's not there. We don't see, the serpent is not Satan. The serpent is just a serpent. It's not described in any way any more than that. There are no apples. There's no real word of fruit when you look in that. That kind of comes to us later. There's no discussion of original sin, no description of the fall of man. It's just that they gain knowledge and they are expelled from the garden. And various theological arguments are placed on top of this as time passes. So right off the bat, it's unclear. They get this knowledge, but it's not clear what the knowledge is. So Kripal describes how, and we're in the Hebrew, this idea of knowing something is sexual. To know, so like we have the phrase, do you know someone biblically? To know someone biblically is to have had sex with them. Some translations ignore the verb to know at all. And like, I think one biblical translation just says, Adam made love to his wife. So what's clear is that this knowledge equals sexuality. So if knowledge equals sex, does sex equal knowledge? That becomes another argument. Lots of different traditions have come forth and said that it was actually sexual intercourse that caused them to be expelled from the garden. But why is this gift of the serpent's gift, so bad? I mean, the serpent not only grants knowledge of sex, which is fundamental to human procreation and fulfillment in life, it's fun, but it drives the serpent's gift drives humans into the world where they belonged in the first place. We are not meant to just live in the Garden of Eden for all time. So the snake sort of speaks to the human desire for sexual emotion and for knowledge, and in fact, sexual knowledge. There's a prominent author named Alan Watts who said that there's an unwritten line in this description of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man, and that's that as the serpent is speaking to Eve, he winks at God, because this is the way it was supposed to be. This was God's plan all along. This was the nature of humanity of all time. This myth tells us about the importance of sexuality, and it hints that it is through sexuality that we can become like God, in fact. So keep in mind that the Hebrew religions, there's, in the very earliest versions of the Hebrew religion, God actually has a wife, or at least a female component to himself, called the Shekinah. So there is this notion that, and they go back and forth. Is this a female side of God, or is this God's wife? But this is an idea that has fallen out, but is still present within a lot of mystic Judaism. And it's really intriguing. In Hinduism, we see that the entire universe is thought to be created by the sexual intercourse between Shiva and Shakti, between God and the goddess. In fact, you see on your right here, that's a lingam. Now, a lingam is a phallic symbol for Shiva. But if you notice, it has the one, the part that sticks up to the top, which is obviously, it's a penis, but it fits into this base that is circular, that is said to be the yoni, the vagina of the goddess. So the idea is that even as we're worshiping God in his sort of aniconic form, in his not human form, you're also worshiping the goddess, and that we are always in constant union, or not, they are always in constant union, and their lovemaking is what keeps the universe going. So what we have here is we have this myth of being expelled from the garden. It shows that sex is dangerous, and many groups actually go on later that we read about today to argue that sexuality in general is bad. But this myth also shows that sex can be a means to revelation, access to the divine, and evolution as human beings. So when we're talking about sex and sexuality, we need to sort of clarify a few terms. So when I say sexuality, I mean the biologically driven instinct influenced by the cultural conditioning and social context in which a person is raised. So sexuality, it's that instinct that we have. And then the way it moves around and is directed, that's all conditioned by culture. Everything about sex and sexuality here, other than just the straight up format of our genitals, is conditioned by culture. Nothing is biologically given. Nothing exists on its own as inherently predetermined. When we say gender, we mean culturally variable models of masculinity and femininity. So it's not inherent, it's not inborn, it's not, you aren't born with an understanding of gender. While you may be born with a penis or a vagina, you are not born as a man or a woman. We are culturally conditioned to be men and be women, and to be masculine and be feminine. And even this understanding of masculinity and femininity is really different. To take an example that's really striking to people when they go to India, men hold hands there all the time. You'll see big, tough guys standing there holding hands, cops with machine guns holding hands in the streets. It's unthinkably unmasculine for an American per se. Or say when I spend time with my Spanish friends, they're always like manhandling me. They're slapping my back and grabbing my knee and throwing their arms around me in a way that American men don't. So those are just two instances about physical contact being different between masculine identified people in different cultures. What about sexual orientation? So sexual orientation, whether you're gay or straight, queer, whatever you want to do with those terminologies. Sexual orientation is the general direction of desire towards either females or males. Or even these days, people talk about being pansexual in the sense that they are attracted to sort of males, females, and sort of queer bodies that can be in between or transitioned or trans. What about celibacy and monasticism? Well, celibacy, when I say celibacy, I mean asceticism, and asceticism is religious practices towards spiritual development. So asceticism, abstaining from sexual acts. Historically, celibacy is used to gain power or access to a transcendent realm or a transcendent state, to evolve. This isn't negative. Everybody kind of thinks of celibacy as it's something negative. You're not having sex, but I have several celibate friends that they're celibate by choice. They're either monks or renunciates of some forth. And I know they always say that celibacy allows them to have significantly more energy in a lot of different directions. They see it as being a very positive thing, and they describe their celibacy as being to some degree a struggle, but that they get much more out of it than they feel they lose by abstaining from sexual activity. Like I was saying, so celibacy can allow for freedom from sexual pressures and a redirection of your energy away from sort of mundane sexual practices or even relationship with your partner type sort of pressures, and you can turn toward yourself or your relationship. Now, the real question is, do they masturbate? Do celibate people masturbate? And I was having a conversation with a bunch of priests one time, and I remember one was like, nah, it's wrong. And the other guy was like, yeah, you know, it really depends on the person. And it's about how you have an understanding of celibacy. So even there's some flexibility. Okay, so what is monasticism, though? So monasticism is living in a same-sex community. It's from the Greek or Latin terms like monos, which means, you know, singular, alone, or unique. Now, among monastics, you have cenobites and anchorites. Cenobites are people who live together, so they live with other monks and nuns. Anchorites are those who live on their own. They're monks that live in total isolation. So living in these communities sort of creates non-biological relationships. So, you know, father, brother, mother, sister. When I spend time in Catholic monasteries, it's really intriguing to me just how familiar the relationships get, and how like older monks and younger monks, sometimes there's a father, son, kind of uncle thing that goes on. And you look at the titles, you know, you have a father is a Catholic priest, or a brother, someone who is in a monastic community but is not yet, or has not been ordained as a priest, would be just called a brother. I have a friend who's a brother in a religious order. What are they? Lasallians, I believe. And his point is, you know, I'm never going to be a priest. Being a brother is all I want. It's really important. But in his order, most of them are teachers, so they generally work in universities and whatnot. But none of them actually, you know, perform the sacraments or become priests. They're called to be just brothers. All right, so we apply sort of queer view, sort of a view that is open to shifting or fluid or non-standard sexualities. We can see that for a queer male or female or an asexual person, they may find personal freedom in monasticism, to the point that and this is in a couple of ways. One, if they live in a culture that does not accept homosexuality, then they're free from the pressures to be a heterosexual if they become a monk. Others would argue that that's even there is irrelevant, but that they can explore sort of their own sexuality in a celibate manner that gives them a great sense of personal freedom. In fact, there's another argument by Kripal. Well, interestingly, Jeffrey Kripal was a monk for quite a while, but he was never a priest. I think he was a Benedictine. And he talked about how, being a very straight male, it was very hard for him to have a relationship with a male divine, a male divinity, being Christ or God, in the same way that many of his fellow brothers who were gay had no problem with. It was easy for them to have this loving relationship with a male divinity. And, you know, for him, his work kind of went in another direction. He started studying goddesses in India, and he found it was much easier for him to understand and explore sort of this emotional sense of relationship with the divine when he was looking at a goddess. I hear that. Okay, so patriarchy. So now we're getting into more of the sort of the political understandings of gender and sexuality. So patriarchy comes from rule, arche, patri, fathers. Patriarchy, rule of the fathers. Rule by those who are biologically male. This is dominance over women and subservience of women unto men. This is generally the most common style of sort of sexual balance or sexual imbalance in the world. Generally, we need to kind of question patriarchy. We need to question it because it's just another arbitrary system. Patriarchy isn't inherent in the world. It is not inherent to us as human beings. But we also should question it because it really kind of, you know, screws half the population. So it's kind of inherently problematic. So patriarchy is rooted in anxiety over paternity, making sure that sons maintain the father's line and that sons are actually descendants of the father. So how do we see this in certain ways? We see that, you know, men in patriarchy support patriarchy because they want to make sure that their sons are their biological heirs, and they want to keep their wealth within their biological line. So look at how we have surnames that are taken from our fathers. Look how we have family lines that we trace father to son to son to son. We don't go mother to mother to mother to mother. I'll say more about that in a second. Look at our stress on female virginity, but we don't really care about male virginity all that much, because people are trying to ensure if you have a virgin bride, then when she has a baby, it will most likely be yours if you are the man who has married her. Restrictions of female movement, keeping women, from having access to a lot of movement, whether that's in the extremes, in the cases of sort of the Middle East and even in India, where women live in purdah and they have no contact with any males outside of their family, to just look at how long it took women to be able to vote, and even how long it took for there to be widespread women driving, for that matter, in the United States. Youth marriage. You want to marry a woman and you want to marry your daughter off as soon as possible, and you want to marry a young girl if at all possible. Now, nobody really says they want to marry a young man, because you want a man who has more wealth, who has had some time to build up that wealth. Then you have the emphasis on procreative sexual acts. So traditionally, in a lot of religious groups, things like oral sex or anal sex or any type of non-procreative sexual activities, including homosexual activities, are considered wrong. Well, why? There's an anxiety there about, the anxiety there is about procreation. It's about, we have to be putting procreation, having children above and ahead of everything. Also, the prohibitions against incest could be argued that they're there because it confuses the succession of property. Now, there are some exceptions here. Notably, Jews trace their lineage matriarchally. So if you do not have a Jewish mother, even if you have a Jewish father, you are technically not a Jew. So that's how they trace their family lineages. I know one rabbi used to always say, a woman will always know that their child is their biological own. A man will never know. So a man can never be sure a child is his own. In India, to take this in another odd way, the bones of your body are thought to be derived from the semen of the father that is planted within the mother, and that creates the bones, and then the woman gives the blood and the flesh. So you are a combination of bone and flesh, but the bone comes from the father and the flesh from the mother. What is feminism? So feminism is the advocacy of equality of the sexes and the establishment of the political, social, and economic rights of the female sex. It's the radical idea that women are people, equivalent to male actors. One of the most important things I think in feminism, at least as I think about feminism in religion, is looking at the normativity of male. How when we're always looking at something, we are assuming that we are a male looking at something, the male gaze. So like one of the things in film studies, they talk about the male gaze, and that when you're looking at a film, you have to ask, whose eyes are you looking for when you're looking at, are you looking through when you're looking at the image? And then they have this theoretical idea that image is male. And when you start looking at it, you realize the vast majority of films really do have a male perspective, as if you are a male viewer, as if the eye of the camera is a male eye. I would argue that that feminism, and in feminist studies and women's studies for that matter, you actually see the best explorations of masculinity. So there's always the argument, why would you study feminism if you're not a woman? And you'd be like, well, because we are all implicated in patriarchy. Men are harmed by patriarchy too in many ways. And feminism and women's studies is a great place to go if you want to understand masculinity more. If you go out and search for masculinity studies, you will generally not find what you would hope for, and you'll find some very regressive thinking there. And that's just the nature of the way the discipline is set up. Okay, I keep wondering on all of this, if we spend a little bit too much time talking about sexual identity. It's really important, but I just keep wondering if we should think more about sex and sexual activity rather than sort of sexual identity. And also, we should be aware that sexual identity is fluid. It can change. We have this notion in the West that sexual identity is you're born this way from the get-go, and you're that way forever. Now, I'm not advocating for conversion therapy or something, but before the modern era, we didn't have these notions of people being gay or straight. And in fact, lots of people engaged in all sorts of different types of sexual activities with different partners, but they wouldn't have considered themselves to be gay or straight. So in Greece, in ancient Greece, for instance, men had lots of relationships, sexual relationships with other men, but they were also married, and they would of course have sex and have children with their wives. But they thought the highest of love was the love between men. That was the love that was transcendent. That's the highest type of love, the most transforming love. Now, the funny thing I've noticed, and I was reading just this incredible book about this about a year ago, is that within Jainism, we actually see, and Kripal writes about this, talking about the same book that I'm thinking of. It's by Padmanabh Jaini, who's a professor at Berkeley, who wrote a book called Gender and Salvation about gender in Jainism. And in Jainism, they have the similar notions that all Indians would have had at the time in the 5th century of there being 3 sexes. So remember, we're a 2-sex society, even though we're moving away from that. So even in the earliest of Sanskrit texts, we see 3 gendered sex markers. These are called linga. Now, I talked about linga before, which was a phallic symbol for God, but linga also means a characteristic or a mark. So we have 3 linga. We have 3 lingas, or 3 sex markers. You have strilinga, so that's being female. Pumlinga, which is being male, so stri means woman, and pum or punsa means male or man, and napumsakalinga, which is kind of fun to say. Napumsakalinga, which is the neuter marker, which is either used in language to show something that doesn't have gender, or it's used to refer to people who are intergender, between gendered, or non-gendered, many of which come up throughout Indian literature. Now, the Jains actually go even further with this, and they have markers of desires. It's the phrase I want to use, and that marker is veda. Remember Veda? The Vedas, the transcendent truth. Well, the Jains don't accept the Vedas like the Hindus do, but they have a notion of Veda, and they have Stri Veda, Pum Veda, and Nampumsa Veda. Similar words. Stri Veda means oriented toward, so a Stri Veda is someone who is typically female and oriented toward male. A Pum Veda is someone who's oriented toward female. And a Nampumsa Veda would be someone who is oriented toward people who are non-gendered. But they will argue that a biological male, so a Pumlinga, can have a Stri Veda, so thereby they are sexually attracted to males. 5th century, they have a very sophisticated notion of gender and sexuality. All right, so what about purity codes? We've talked about these quite a bit. So purity codes are important here. Food and sex are about what goes in and what goes out of our bodies. So think of it this way. Purity codes are all arbitrary. We know this because when we compare cultures, one person will be like, you can't eat beef. And other people will be like, we love beef. Why are you eating chicken? Like, oh, you can't eat chicken. So, we can see that people have different understandings of purity codes and food. And that tells us that it's not a universal, that it's arbitrary, that it's constructed. So I quite like to eat beef, and I feel it's very healthy to eat beef. But a Hindu would find this abhorrent and think that eating beef is wrong and even unnatural. A Chinese person would be baffled by Muslims who don't eat pork because they eat quite a bit of pork and consider it to be quite healthy. So the rejected food, when someone rejects it, is thought to be inherently bad. But the comparative practice, as I was saying, shows that no thing is inherently bad or impure. Now let's just think about this for a second. What about vegetarianism? So some people argue that vegetarianism and veganism are inherently more healthy. Science goes back and forth on that. But if you talk to vegetarians and vegans, they will tell you it is absolutely more healthy. But over time, what you see is that folks tend to associate eating meat not just with ill health, but also impurity. So one of the reasons I was a vegetarian for years, and I remember someone asking why I didn't go vegan, and I thought it's because I go to parties and I see dudes just standing in the kitchen talking about how ranch dressing is gross, and then like trying to gross each other out talking about oil and eggs. And I'm like, I don't want to be that kind of person. But it's funny that you make a dietary sort of choice or decision, and over time you develop these emotions around it. So whereas you once ate meat perfectly fine, later you'll think, meat is really gross. So think about how those emotions work. I mean, I have an uncle who would never eat chicken because he was served undercooked chicken in the military. And one time I had a partner who never grew up eating meat, though they ate meat when we were together, and I was always tasked with preparing all the meat because they would just be like, oh, what are you doing? It's so gross. So what I want to sort of question you is, even when we think about food in a non-religious way, how are we actually kind of using similar religious rhetoric in our thoughts about food? All right, so should you establish a purity system, you are also going to have people that will violate that purity system. And we call this transgression. Now, those people that consciously transgress, that do it purposely, often will argue that they transgress purity laws in order to become free from restrictions, to become free from those laws, or they will even argue that violating purity laws causes them to have an experience, will cause them to open up an opportunity to see the world more clearly. So what are a few of these? Like Jeffrey Kripal gives some examples, and I'll give some more. So in Tantra, which is a type of practice and a mode of hyper-ritual religion in India, you have practitioners who are known as heroes, or viras, from the Indo-European root vir, from which we get virility, or so these heroes will consume impure substances. They talk about the 5 M's there, which are meat, wine, sexual intercourse, parched grains, we don't really understand that one, and fish. These are things that traditionally a Brahmin would eat. In their rituals, they eat these substances, and it's thought that they are freed from, by doing this, they're freed from their own sort of hang-ups, but also by doing that, they are able to find a mystical experience, an experience of God, even in the most painful or the most disgusting of things. So they have ritualized sex, but there's very clear arguments that if you're going to have this ritualized sex, the person you should do it with is not your wife. It would be much better for it to be your own grandmother. So the idea is you're violating purity codes and finding God within that, or finding the presence of the holy within the unholy. Cannibalism is considered to be absolutely wrong, but in communion, the sacraments create a powerful experience. You're drinking blood and eating flesh. Remember, when that bell rings in the Mass, boom, that communion wafer is Christ's body. It has become flesh. So even there's a transgression, and it creates something very powerful. Art often uses transgression to agitate people and make powerful images. So there's a classic image called the Piss Christ, which is a crucifix that's in a jar of urine. Now, this got everybody really pissed off. And okay, all right, I got everybody pissed off. And I remember I was actually in a class one time, I can't remember the class it was in, but I remember the professor put up this image, and it's quite a stunning, it's a very beautiful image, actually, when you really look at it. And all the Christians in the room went just apey. And finally, one of them, the most aggressive of the Christians, who was really, really bothered by this image, said, well, why did he do this anyway? And the professor said, yeah, he said it symbolizes Christ's suffering in the world and how the world treats Christ poorly. And then suddenly everybody turned around and they weren't mad anymore. Like, oh, that kind of makes sense. So transgression can create powerful experiences that can be manipulated in exciting ways. The first concert, rock and roll, I ever went to was a band called Gwar. If you know anything about Gwar, they dress up in crazy costumes and spew fluids all over the place that they like pipe in just gallons and gallons of like fake blood and colored substances, and it's everywhere, and they do outlandish, crazy things. And, you know, rock and roll never sounded so good to me. But again, so there's a transgression there. They're stimulating, urinating and ejaculating and bodily functions and bleeding all over the crowd. Transgression. I suggest you look up the fine musical stylings of G.G. Allin if you'd like to learn more about transgression and punk rock. Buddhists will actually meditate on corpses. Now, I had an Ajahn I used to spend a lot of time with, and he was telling me when he was, Ajahn means a Buddhist monk and teacher. he was a white guy, but he was in a Thai Buddhist tradition, that he got all of these pictures of like horrible car accidents and like surgery pictures, and he put them all over where he lived, so he was always looking at dead bodies. And the idea was that being around all those dead bodies gave him a sense of the reality of death, but also of the weirdness of humanity. I remember him once saying one time, look, you think a woman has beautiful eyes? Well, imagine them cut out and hold them in your hands. Are they still beautiful? So Buddhist monks will also, and a lot of Hindus do this as well. Well, not a lot, but some do. They'll actually take a skull and they'll cut it in half, and then they'll eat out of that skull bowl. So again, transgression to realize the truth of death. The founder of the Quakers, George Fox, was beaten and imprisoned because he refused to tip his hat at his superiors. Another transgression. What about ritual nudity? This got me thinking. So remember, let's go back to the Jains. So in Jainism, you have the division of the two groups two like sort of styles of Jainism are Shvetambara and Digambara. Shvetambaras always wear white. Digambaras are clad in space. They are clad in the directions, or as I'll say in a second, sky clad. So these monks argue, the monks that do not wear clothes argue that clothing is a possession, and any possession generates karma, so that's bad for your spiritual development. The ones in white say, no, you can have a few things, but you don't really own them, and they really actually keep you from being distracted and enable you to be more spiritually awakened. And then they all argue that women need to wear white all the time because menstruation is a problem for men looking at them, and because the female body will cause excitement in other monks and other people who see them. Yes, there's nothing more than misogyny in there. Yes, and that women who are naked will be in danger of being raped all the time. So those are some of their arguments. And the Digambaras and Shvetambaras actually go back and forth with. The Digambaras say that because they can't be naked and do spiritual practice, they'll never be enlightened. And the Shvetambaras say, no, they're in white too, so they can become enlightened. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter because nobody's getting enlightened in this era. So what about ritual nudity in our culture or Western culture? So I reached out to an old pal of mine. His name is Jason Mankey, and he's kind of a popular pagan author now. He lives in the Bay Area, and I was a part of a ritual group of neo-pagans with him in the 90s. Now, according to Jason Mankey, witchcraft traditions, namely the Alexandrians and the Gardnerians. Now, I'm talking very specifically about sort of like, when I say Wicca or neo-pagan, I mean a broad branch of religious traditions. Within neo-paganism, there are groups that call themselves witches and say they do witchcraft, and they're called either Alexandrians or Gardnerians, and there's more. In those groups, you take an initiation to join a group called a coven, and you continue to practice with that group. So generally, neo-pagans are just kind of people who run around and like, I'm a neo-shaman, I'm a Wiccan, I'm a whatever. Let's all go to the Renaissance Festival. But these are specific initiatory orders. Now, Jason explains to me that the Alexandrians and the Gardnerians, when they do their initiations, they always use ritual nudity. And they view this as being sort of liberating and being equalizing. Now, during the 1960s, many general pagan groups outside of those specific initiatory orders started doing ritual practice in the nude, arguing that they were body positive and that ritual nudity was a way to express their body positivity about all body shapes and about the body in general as a holy thing. Now, since the 1990s, in fact, nudity has become much less common in general pagan rituals. And if you go around and you go to a lot of pagan rituals, you'll hear that a lot of people say, it's clothing optional, but the majority of people do wear clothing. You don't see a lot of public ritual practices in the Wiccan community since the 90s in which people use ritual nudity. All right, so let's go to Christianity. Now, Jeffrey Kripal makes a very important point. When we're applying comparison and we're doing religious studies, we need to apply it to all religions and all traditions, including our own. This he calls the golden rule. If you're going to do it to one religion, you got to do it to all religions. So there's quite a bit of transgression and unexpected sexuality that we don't think of very often in the history of Christianity. And I'm going to just present a few of Kripal's points here. So Christ, in fact, rejected the purity codes and kosher laws of his Jewish context, But he also expanded sort of other notions of purity and sort of legality, which I'll talk about in a second. So he may have rejected these kosher laws, but he extended, say, for one instance, the sin of adultery to not just having sex outside of marriage, but to any adulterous thoughts. In fact, he says, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast to hell. In another place, he says, if your right hand offends you, you should cut it off. And this is clearly kind of the gaze of adultery. So if you cast your eye covetously on another man's wife, you should pluck your eye out. So Christ isn't saying that you should actually cut your eye out, but he is saying you should be that you should take adulterous thoughts that seriously. And a lot of scholars have argued that when he talks about the right hand, he's actually making a reference to masturbation. So what is this Christ guy? Well, Christ is complicated. In fact, we read that in his lineages, he traces his own lineage to Ruth and Tamar, and these are sort of complicated female sexual manipulators in the Hebrew Bible. And he also is the son of a virgin bride, so that's a complicated sexuality there too. He used to hang out with impure people. I mean, he would hang out with tax collectors and sex workers, but his message and his community was still dedicated to the Jewish people. In fact, we only see with Paul, the Apostle Paul, that he extended Christianity to the non-Jewish and the Hellenistic world. Christ rejects the family. He, in fact, says that you should leave your family, that you should hate your father, stressing that his followers should be reborn into a new type of family in the community of the Christians. Jesus even argues that we ought to be castrated for the kingdom of heaven, making ourselves eunuchs. Now, there is some history of people castrating themselves, monks castrating themselves, but it was never a wide practice. So what's he getting at here? Well, eunuchs were not considered exactly the best of people in the Roman world. They were very ambivalent. They were considered queer in many ways. So that was a problem. So why is Christ saying that? Well, Christ, he's subverting things. In fact, in India, you have people called hijras who are eunuchs. They may or may not have been castrated, but they're men that dress as women, and they're ambivalent. So in one sense, they're considered very dangerous. They're considered impure. But on the other hand, if you have a new home or you have a baby, you have to have a hijra come by and bless your home or your baby, or you'll get really bad luck. And people are really worried by the hijra. If they look at you and you look back at them, you got to make nice with them because they'll curse you. So within this notion of the eunuch, there's a lot of ambivalence and can often be quite a bit of power there. So the scholar, or also even one more, as I said before, the sacraments in communion are flesh and blood, cannibalism. So all of these are complicated. And in fact, one scholar has said that, the scholar Theodore Jennings argued that Jesus was constantly, knowingly subverting the conventions of his culture. Now, I do want to kind of argue here that, we're looking at scriptures, but Christianity is not exactly the same as scriptures. No religion is the same as its scriptures. All religions pick and choose what to stress and what to ignore. If we're looking for patterns of inconsistencies or hypocrisy, you're missing the complexity of Christian evolution. So if we find odd things in Christianity, it doesn't make Christianity any less valid or valuable. And when we're looking at scriptures, we have to remember they're just scriptures. We don't know that any of these things actually happened or the practices were actually done. On that, in post-Christ Christian sexual practices, you see things like celibacy, which can be considered a marriage to God or Christ. You would also see that even in the Roman times, it was insisted that women be veiled, and so to be covered in clothes and be subservient. And in fact, some of the later Christian fathers argue that women must always be veiled because it prevents them from being raped by angels and demons. So that's kind of a tough call, but if you look into the world of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, angels are constantly kind of coming down and raping people, or people are willingly having sex with them. And in fact, there's some traditions of, or some understandings of giants who are born of angel fathers and human mothers. So there's also, we see a description that Kripal talks about ritualized sexual intercourse between man and wife. And the idea is that they have this ritualized intercourse to create a pious child. And I'll talk about something else in just a second. There's also reported masturbatory ritual in which semen and menstrual blood are consumed as the body and blood of Christ. Also, there's the collection of semen and menstrual blood that are thought to contain souls that can be saved. Now, these last two might not happen. These could be critiques that are made by outsiders. But I will tell you that both of those practices are done by contemporary esotericists, by people who are doing magic these days. One of the really common, well, it's not a common practice, but something that people talk about a lot, is having ritualized intercourse to conceive a child, to create a moon child. So a divine child, or even there's some discussion, there's always the lore around that there were Satanists in the 1960s that were having sexual intercourses and rituals in order to try to create the Antichrist. That's neither here nor there. I know some weirdos in LA. So yes, these last two practices, and I actually know a number of people who are doing the consumption of sexual fluids and using sexual fluids in rituals. One common practice is to take consecrated semen that's been sort of ritually expelled, ejaculated, and they'll actually smear this and also menstrual blood on items, and that gives them a sanctified power. And they're able to charge those items not only with psychic power by focusing on it, but by putting that biological seal on it to keep energy in there. So that is to say, if somebody hands you an amulet, you might want to wash your hands. All right, supersexualities. And I think this is actually kind of the coolest part of what we're looking at today. So sexual anxiety runs through all of religious narrative. I've been very ambivalent about sexuality this whole time, but sexuality can also be used to experience and enhance religious experiences. In the Protestant world, and lately there's been all of this writing of like Protestant sex manuals, they have this idea that sex between a husband and wife is a gift from God, that sexuality isn't bad, and that romantic love teaches us about the divine love that can be, that God and Christ feel for us. In the Jewish tradition, we have certain mystical rabbis and Kabbalists who would have intercourse with their wives on the Sabbath in order to arouse Shekinah. Remember Shekinah? God's the female, God's wife, or the female component of God. The idea is they would have sexual activity with their wives to raise that Shekinah or invoke that Shekinah and bind and connect her back to the male Godhead. Thereby, you're healing and repairing the world. Tikkun, to heal the world, is the big concept. The Jews are called to heal the world. Finally, we have yogi bodies, the bodies of yogis. So yogis will actually manipulate hydraulically. So you'll see on your right, you see the Ida and the Pingala and the Sushumna. There's the idea that you have the right channel, the left channel, and the central channel, and you have your energies move through there. And they practice moving those energies, breaths, or winds into the central channel and moving them up and down the body. This can also be done with semen. The idea is that semen can be contracted and can be pushed up through the central channel into the head, where it's transmuted into nectar that will bring about magic powers and immortality. Those are just a few. This is quite big in Tantra too. I like to call it the hydraulic method. I don't need to talk about that. Yeah, never mind. So to go further, sexual activities may become a gateway to transcendent experiences. The body, the very body that we live in, can be used to enhance the spirit, because we're always thinking of our soul as like this consciousness stream. Our interior voice is like our soul. Well, what if our body can be used to enhance religion and experience religion? So unlike most religious asceticism that denies the body or sees the body as impure or sexuality as impure, there are other groups that say that sexuality is and the body are the ways to experience religion. So the serpent's gift that I started this lecture with, it makes Adam and Eve like God. To be like, and God, in fact, later, and he says in the plural, which is odd, God says that Adam has become like one of us. So that knowledge that is considered sexual makes one like a god. Remember that God is in plural here, and Adonai is in plural, one name for God, and we have Shekinah, so you would have the YHVH, Yahweh, and Shekinah as a sort of a god and a god's wife as equal poles of divinity. Supersexualities. This is some interesting stuff here. So Kripal describes supersexualities as altered states of energy and consciousness, commonly experienced both as sexual and as the means of divinization, transcendence, and or religious transformation. Let me give you 3 examples here. Traditional tantric sex. You've heard of tantric sex. People talk about tantric sex all the time. Traditional tantric sex doesn't have anything to do with orgasms in any manner. In the Buddhist traditions of tantric sex, one never ejaculates. And notice I keep using the male perspective. That's because all the texts are written from a male perspective. That's the way it is. So one does not ejaculate. So in tantric sex, in fact, one will, in the Hindu tantric sex, it isn't about any sort of experience of sex. It's about violating purity codes in Tantra, like I said before, but it's also not ritualizing sex, sexualizing rituals. So you will act out traditional rituals in a sexual manner. Think about a homa offering, so a big fire pit with a ladle, like in the Agnihotra, and you pour the milk into the fire. I think it's not too hard to see that symbolism and how that could be applied in a sexual manner with a consort. So obviously the homa would be the vagina, the ladle would be a penis, and if we just use the Agnihotra, the milk would be semen. Then in Tantra, generally you would take the menstrual blood, because the best time to do tantric sex is when a woman is menstruating, and the semen, they are combined, then they are mixed with other substances, or they are ritually manipulated, and then they are consumed by the mouth in order to transform a person, to either initiate you into a group or a cult, or to transform you, because these are the powerful substances that will change your body and give you superpowers. Now, what about Neo-Tantra? So this has really nothing to do with Tantra, and this is generally what you're hearing when you hear Sting talking about having 6-hour orgasms. Neo-Tantra, as a friend of mine once was pounding on the table after talking to me about prostate massage for half an hour. I was pounding on this table. He's like, don't people understand? Tantra comes from Marin County, California, not India. And I'm like, you are right on this one. So Neo-Tantra, by which I have this lovely picture of this couple up here on the left, would be sort of using or channeling, harnessing orgasms, and also having marathon sex and having sexual pleasure to the highest extent as possible. So when people talk about Tantra, they're generally talking about sexual bliss in a way that you don't see in the Indic context, but you do in the Tibetan one, and there's some new research coming out on that. Finally, I want to talk about sex magic. On the left there at the bottom is a man named Pascal Beverly Randolph. He was half Black, he was an American, and he lived in the 19th century. So it was a tough life for him, but he posited the most clear explanations of sex magic that are now used throughout the esoteric world when people talk about sex magic. What he was talking about was how a man and a woman could unite, and this is supposed to be between man and wife, would unite and have sex as consciously as possible, focusing on all their energies, all their connection, and that would do a number of things. One, it would increase the romantic connection between the two. And he was one of the first sort of pro-sex writers in the Western world, in the sense that he really put this high value on sexual bliss between partners. But he also posits that if the will is focused with both partners at the moment of orgasm, you can expel that will into the world and it will cause changes. So the majority of sex magical practices of the people that I know that perform them, it is really about getting a clear intention, being focused on that intention in the sexual act, whether it is with a partner or by oneself, and then being even more hyper-focused at the moment of orgasm to cause a change in the world or a change in yourself. The idea is the orgasm is the catalyst for change and projecting the will out into the world. So we have, Kripal describes a woman's book called Transcendent Sex by Jenny Wade. She's, I believe, a psychologist and a university professor. Jenny Wade is a Catholic, who had this really powerful sexual experience of white light, becoming the void, and non-duality. That sounds really Buddhist. And from that, she was like, I gotta figure that if this happened to me, I gotta figure out what this is. So she actually documents 91 different cases of individuals who had religious experiences in a sexual context. These include streams of liquid light shooting out of the top of the head or the skull. Does that sound like? It sounds exactly like those yogi practices I mentioned. You have extreme bodily heat, so that the body in the sexual act or at the moment of orgasm becomes incredibly hot. Now, Tibetans talk about this, and they call it tumo, and they cultivate it in Tibetan Buddhist practice to build an inner fire to the point that you're supposed to be able to build up that inner fire and be able to sit outside, and someone will, in the winter, and someone will throw a wet sheet on you, and you will not shiver, but you'll heat up so much that you'll dry the sheet. And an interesting note, I knew a guy who was really good at this tumo practice, and he never had to wear a coat. So that's handy. That's handy. All right, so sexual activity can invoke or attract beings from other realms, whether it's the fifth dimension, the fourth dimension, or the aliens. You never know with the aliens. Also, shamanic shape-shifting into animals like bears or wolves, whether this is a vision or actually becoming a bear or a wolf, well, that depends on what you want to think. Developing paranormal abilities, namely telepathy and mind reading, past life memories or visions that are described as being like watching a movie, but it's going on in your head, stopping time and a sense of eternity, experience of every cell vibrating, leading to an out-of-body experience and or being inside and outside of the body at the same time, which actually sounds exactly like one experience that Kripal writes about of experiencing the goddess when he was doing his field work. So all of this is to note that the body can be used to cultivate spiritual experiences, religious experiences, and even develop paranormal powers. And as I will continue to argue, these ecstatic states, these vision states, these paranormal powers are really what's going on when we're talking about religion. And when people talk about religion in general in ways that aren't religious, that's what gets really interesting. So what could be more religious than, I don't know, being contacted by a being from another dimension? That's interacting with God. Or being able to have a vision in which one can read one another's thoughts. This is found throughout all of the, pretty much every religious tradition. You have people who are telepathic. So all of these are in fact religious ideas, and Jenny Wade has documented how they can come about due to sexual activity, catalyzed by sexual activity, or while in sexually active states. So what are our conclusions here? Sex and sexuality are enmeshed in all religious thinking. We ought to take sex and sexuality into consideration when we're doing any type of religious studies. And we should do this in a number of ways. We ought to look at bodies and how the body is used to express and experience religion. We ought to look at how gender and how religions depict gender and regulate gender. We must cast the hermeneutic of suspicion upon the male gaze and male dominance. When I say hermeneutic of suspicion, I mean you're doing the mental practice of interpreting things, but being very suspicious. So hermeneutic suspicion against patriarchy and the male gaze. We ought to look at the manner in which sexuality is regulated, including celibacy, marriage, and sexual rituals. And finally, we have to see that sexuality can be a means toward supersexuality or toward ecstatic states and superpowers. All right, I'll catch you next time.